My name is Elizabeth Sorensen. I'm here with Bernardine Evaristo, the supremely talented author, university professor, poet, playwright, activist. She is here today to talk a little bit about her newest book, Manifesto on Never Giving Up. She's written over 7 books, a real focus on history, roots, heritage, the experience of the other in England. I guess my first question for you would be, how has the literary landscape progressed since you started writing?
Yeah, well, thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. My first time in Palm Springs. Yes. So I came of age in the late 70s, early 80s. I went to drama school from 79 to 82, and then I began my career in the arts. And it was a very different climate then to the Britain that exists today. For those of you who don't know, I don't know what people know here about the UK, but it is a multicultural country, and it has, the first recorded Africans in Britain were a legion of Moors who were stationed at Hadrian's Wall in the north of the country 1800 years ago. So that was the first recorded presence of Africans. And there has been continued presence ever since, especially in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. But in the 20th century, the large migration of people from Britain's former colonies, people from the Caribbean and Africa and also Asia, happened after the Second World War, and people were brought in from the colonies to work in the various industries because of the depletion of servicemen during the war, because so many people died, so they needed to replenish the workforce. And my father was part of that generation, so he arrived in Britain from Nigeria in 1949 and settled in London and married my white English mother and had 8 children in 10 years. It's between, yep. And that was a lot then. That was a lot then as well. And had, over a period of 10 years, so from the sort of mid-50s to the mid-60s. And I grew up in what was a very white area of London at the time called Woolwich. It no longer is, because London is always in flux. The demographics are shifting all the time over the decades. Areas that were once really poor, like you might know of Notting Hill because of the film, then become extremely, well, they were rich and then they became very poor and then they became very rich. So it's a city that is constantly shifting. And the town I grew up in, Woolwich, which is in southeast London, was a very white area at that time in the 60s and 70s. And, my father was practically the only Nigerian black man in the town. And we were a family who stood out because we were an interracial family, and there were lots of us as well. And so, that was what I grew up with, growing up in a society where you didn't see yourself reflected in that society, and where the society had spent a few hundred years being brainwashed about people from its former colonies. Because of the slave trade, there was the philosophy that developed to justify the slave trade, and that was that Africans were presented as savages. And so at the point at which my father turned up in Britain in the late 1940s, British society had been, I always say, brainwashed into thinking of black people as lesser human beings, as less civilized, as more savage than the Europeans. And so he faced the sort of frontline racism that existed then. Anti-racist legislation in the UK didn't happen until I was 15. So it was actually legal to be racist up until that point, in the same way that the Sex Discrimination Act didn't happen until I was about 15, so it was also legal to be sexist. And so I was growing up in this society where we didn't look like the people around us, where the family home was attacked by some of the youths in the area. They used to smash our windows in on a regular basis. And yet at the same time, I didn't really know much about my father's Nigerian culture, but I felt British, because I was British. It was the country I was born into. It was the only culture that I knew. I didn't know my father's language, never been to Nigeria. He never told us anything about his culture. And so because we were children who were, as was called, coloured, we were treated differently to the people, to everybody else. And that, in a sense, was the beginning of my formation as a creative person, because when I came of age and got involved in feminist politics and black politics, by the time I was at drama school, I then decided that as a writer, well, I didn't even decide it, it just happened organically, that as a writer, what I would do would be to write the stories that didn't exist when I was growing up, and to write our stories into the literary landscape, into the cultural landscape. And so that's what I did. When I started writing professionally for theatre originally in 1982, I would say that black women in Britain, I was writing as a black woman, I was running a theatre company called Theatre Black Women, which I co-founded, that we were completely marginalised and invisible in sort of wider British society. We weren't represented in politics, we weren't represented in the media. There was an import of African American culture to a certain extent, you know, the 3 Degrees, the Supremes and so on. They were popular cultural figures, but we didn't really have much of our own homegrown talent. And so I was in a culture where I wanted to be, you know, participating as a creative person, but I was pushed to the sides and made invisible, and there was very little interest in us. When I think about today, when we have like 2 blockbuster films that have just come out last year, The Woman King and Wakanda Forever, which I think they're both incredible films, and they have feisty, powerful black women at the centre, and they are Hollywood blockbusters. That is so different to the culture that I grew up in, when nobody could even conceive of black women as being that interesting. And so there were very few books published by black British writers at that time, and those that did exist were by mainly men from the Caribbean. Homegrown black British women's fiction hadn't really been developed in the early 80s. It would take another decade or so before that began to happen, and that progress has been very slow. And so I always felt as a writer that I was writing against the so-called mainstream, that I was writing against a status quo that did not consider me important enough, did not consider the stories of homegrown black British women important. African American women writers did make a name for themselves in Britain once they become famous here in the sort of early 80s. In particular, Alice Walker became, you know, huge because of The Colour Purple, and then Toni Morrison, Gloria Naylor, Audre Lorde came over to the UK. She used to visit on a regular basis. So the African American writers were there, but not British writers. And you fast forward 40 years, and it's a very different landscape, you know, and it happened because of Me Too. It happened because of the Black Lives Matter movement that happened in the UK, as it did in various parts of the world. And suddenly the gaze started to shift, the culture became a bit more receptive. And by the time Girl, Woman, Other was published in 2019, it had become a book that was very much speaking to that moment, even though when I started it in 2013, it wasn't, because the culture hadn't shifted enough at that stage. And so, that's just to give you a sort of a slight taste of the difference between then and now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's riveting, actually. I know that Manifesto is an autobiography, and I wondered, was that a kind of conscious choice to not do another fiction book after the behemoth of Girl, Woman, Other, the best-selling Booker Prize, you know, #1? I don't know. As a writer, are you like, I'll do an, yeah.
You can't really compare a memoir with a novel. And when it came to discussing with my publisher the next book I was going to publish, I didn't have it in me actually at that stage to write another novel, because Girl, Woman, Other has these 12 characters. It took so many years to write. I didn't even want to think about writing another fictional character in long form fiction. And so I thought I would write about my life, because suddenly there was a huge amount of interest in my life where there had been very little before. It was my 8th book. I'd written for theatre, I've written essays, poetry, for radio. I've written in various genres. I'd been around a long time. I had an interesting family background, and I just thought, I want to tell people about this. And so Manifesto on Never Giving Up is a memoir, and it's about my life and my creativity. That is the angle through which I explore my life. I had never thought that I would write any kind of autobiography, a sort of traditional autobiography, like this is the story of my life, because I didn't know how you could squeeze your life into a book of, I don't know, 100,000, 70, 100,000 words. It felt like it was too big a project. What do you leave out? What do you put in? Also, if you have to be sensitive to other people's privacy, and so on and so forth. But actually, the book that I did write was one where, because everything was seen through the prism of my creativity, it was kind of easier to make decisions about what to put in and what to put out. So I don't go into a great deal of depth about my life as a whole from the day I was born, but I've divided the book into sections. So there's a section which is about my origins, my family history, my parents. My origins are Irish, German, Brazilian, Nigerian, and English. And on the British side, I can track back my family. Well, somebody did it for me, 300 years, right? So I actually have a 300-year unbroken history in the UK, and I'm sure it goes back further. So I talk about that at the beginning of Manifesto, and I talk about how we are shaped by our backgrounds, by our ancestry, and how the strength that I have, which I inherited from my parents, who were both incredibly strong individuals. Black man, white woman marrying in Britain in the 1950s wasn't a done thing, but they loved each other, and that was that. But also what I imagine I inherited from the ancestors I didn't know. The most of whom were people who migrated from one country to another, either in exile or for my economic reasons. And so going back, in terms of my known ancestry, the individuals whose names I know, I can go back probably about 170 years to the German immigrant who arrived in Woolwich, where I grew up, in the 1860s and became a baker, because I don't know if you know, but a lot of Germans migrated in the second half of the 19th century because they had to for economic reasons. So he settled in Woolwich, although I didn't know that when I was growing up, that my ancestor in Woolwich had come from Germany at that time. And what it took to leave one country, to settle in another, and to make a life for yourself, and to face all kinds of bigotry, which was often the case. So he settled, and then the First World War happened, and his shop was broken. People broke the windows of his shop, and he died a year after the end of the First World War. So I think I sort of meditate on the ancestry that I have and how that has shaped me as an individual. Then I look at my relationships that I've had over the years, and how
mental dominatrix.
Mental dominatrix is one of them, and how read the book, find out.
Get the book; it's amazing. Go buy it after this, by the way.
And
it's incredible.
How the decisions I made about the relationships that I had, and how they have also affected my creativity. And I look at the jobs, the living situations that I've had, because I've lived in many, many different homes over the years. I look at creative process and so on and so forth. And all of those things were things that I felt people would be interested in, because most people didn't really know me and don't really know my life story, And that's probably the same for a lot of writers. You might know the work, you might maybe read some essays about writers, but you don't really know their life story. And so that's what I did with the book. And I also wanted it to be inspirational to people who come from working class background, as I did, who come from a culture where you were seen as an outsider, where you're not fully accepted, not 100% integrated, where you have to face the obstacles that come with all kinds of bigotry, but you still persist and choose a path that is a creative path, as I did, and then suddenly, at a later age and stage, break through in a very big way.
So do you, on reflection, do you think success at a later stage, I mean, I have a lot of questions for you, but do you think success at a later stage is perhaps more pleasant, more enjoyable than success when you're maybe younger and it's your first novel? And I don't know, what do you think about that?
It's very easy for me to say that. I think it's very sweet at the age of 60 to win the Booker Prize and suddenly to sell over 1 million copies and 60 foreign languages, 60
Amazing.
foreign rights and so on.
Yeah.
You know, it's an incredible thing when you have been ambitious and you have wanted that for your work. Because when we write our books, I don't think we're imagining that we're writing it for 200 people, right? You want to reach as wide an audience as possible. So for me, it was absolutely thrilling, and I'm still riding the wave of that, I think. When you're younger, of course, that is what you want, most people, and when they're in the arts. Obviously, you want to be taken seriously, you want to earn a good living from your writing, you want to reach a wide audience, but it's very hard to maintain that as a writer, and we know of so many instances of writers who do become very successful very young and don't maintain it. Some do, of course, but I think, yeah, that in a way that's the message of the book. It's like, don't give up, keep going. If this is what you want for yourself, it may happen, but it can only happen if you keep going with your creativity.
And I think exactly what you said, the testament of the book is you're really honest. Like, you're not saying, oh, like, I wrote this and then I got this job and then I became really successful. You talk about the grit, you talk about the failure, you give like very concrete examples of not only how you write, but how you get inspiration and, you know, all the specific details that I imagine as a writer, you really want to know. And I would say I have a couple questions around the Booker because it's just incredible, and I'm so happy to hear that you're still riding the wave of that. Because as a fan of yours, I know that if I could just ask you to tell a couple stories, maybe one is about your positive manifestation. I know when you wrote also the kind of semi-autobiography Laura. You had some sort of positive manifestation around the Booker. And also, if you could walk us through the day, the day you found out you got it. I just think probably we'd want to hear about those couple things.
Yep.
They're really cool.
So my second book was a book called Lara, which was a fictionalized version of my family history. It's a verse novel, and it goes into the different strands that I mentioned of my family history and the figures that I knew about and maybe even knew, such as my grandmother and so on, and I bring them all to life and just create this kind of epic about my background. And when that book was published in 1997, I had spent a few years doing a lot of personal development work, which came from here, mostly. Various books that were about aiming big and setting goals for yourself, like unrealistic goals for yourself, and positive thinking and going for it, all the sort of yes you canism of America, which isn't the British culture, really, I have to say. It still isn't the British culture. And so I was coming into the publishing world. I'd published one book. I wasn't really sort of embedded in it yet. And I thought, well, the Booker Prize is kind of like such a big deal in the UK and it has such a ripple effect around the world. I think, well, if I'm going to publish books, why don't I imagine that I might one day win the Booker Prize? And so I did creative visualizations and affirmations about winning the Booker Prize, which I've still got. I have a trunk full of affirmations. Most of them on little cards that I wrote in the 90s, in my 30s. And I visualized winning the Booker Prize. And I sort of maintained that visualization for a while. And then to stop yourself getting obsessed about things, you just kind of let it go. And then when I did win the Booker Prize, I remembered that I had visualized winning the Booker Prize. And so I started to tell people about it. And of course, people are very interested in that. But I have to say that I didn't win the Booker Prize because I'd visualized it.
Did you?
I don't think so, no. But I think what it is, it's about self-belief, believing that this might possibly be possible for me one day, even though you must remember that I was the first black woman to win it in 50 years. So there wasn't really, I wasn't having this vision in a culture where it was going to be likely, because it wasn't likely until I did win it. And that was like 23 or so years later, right? But it kind of meant that I had this self-belief that I continued writing what I wanted to write. I've never compromised. I'm an experimental writer. I do my own thing. And I think it's part of the machinery that just kept me going, having this vision. Because I do know writers who give up, and writers who talk themselves out of things, writers who never think they're going to achieve anything big with their careers, writers who are of my generation. And guess what? They do talk themselves out of their careers. You know, they do stop writing. They do give up. That negative mindset is so, it's just so, damaging, psychologically, psychically damaging. And so I was doing the opposite of that. Okay, I'm going to win the Booker. I've won the Booker, because an affirmation is, I've won it. Not that I've won it. And of course, you don't tell anyone this. Because if you tell people this, they're just like, oh God, she's crazy. She's lost it. But that's what I did, and then it happened. So you want to know about the day?
Yes, please.
So there's a big build-up to the Booker. It begins when you're longlisted. I think that's in July, and there's the long list had about 13 books on it. And then as soon as I was longlisted, I was visualizing winning it. I have friends who are shortlisted for prizes, and sometimes they win them, and they say, when I'm shortlisted, I'm not going to win it. No way I'm going to win it. I thought, I can't be that person. I have to think I'm going to win it. So I started focusing on winning it when I was longlisted. And then I was shortlisted, and I intensified my focus on winning it. And then the media starts to take more of an interest in your work. The book, at the point at which it was longlisted, had done the same as my other books. It got great reviews, but it wasn't selling particularly well. Once it's longlisted, the books start to sell, and then shortlist, definitely it sells. And then in the build-up to the ceremony, the shortlisted writers do some events together around the country. So for my year, it was Margaret Atwood, Salman Rushdie, Chigozie Obioma, Elif Shafak, and Lucy Ellman. So I think we did about 3 events together, culminating with one at the South Bank in the Royal Festival Hall, which is was the biggest cultural centre in the country. And then there's a lot of, they have the, the bookies. There's a lot of betting going on about who's going to win. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. There were 5 judges. They didn't know. They didn't know until that meeting. That's the case, right? They don't know until the final meeting who's going to win. So then on the day of, you turn up for a reception at the Guildhall. The Guildhall is, it's about 1,000 years old. It's this building in the middle of the City of London that used to be the Guild Hall, so like the centre of all the guilds that operated within the City of London, as in the city within the city. For those of you who don't know, that's around the square mile of the centre of London. And there's this drinks reception, and it's a nightmare because the other writers are there, the media's there, literary people are there, you can't relax. Champagne is on offer, and you just get this over and done with. And then you go in for a banquet in the banqueting hall, which, this year they changed it, but it's very, very grand. And the banquet goes on for about 4 hours. You can't eat, you can't drink in case you win. And you're all seated at these tables, and the tables that the writers are seated at are different tables, and they're strategically placed around the room. And I was there with my editor, Simon Prosser, and he's been at the Booker ceremony many times. His authors have been shortlisted many times, and he said everybody's trying to guess about the positioning of the tables in terms of who might be winning it, because some tables are nearer the front, some tables are more accessible than others. And so I was sitting at a table near the front, and Margaret Atwood was sitting over there, a table next to me, and then the cameras are roving around. And anyway, so this banquet goes on forever, and there's presentations and performances of extracts of novels and so on. And then the chair of judges then got onto the stage to make the announcement. And he then said something that just shocked the room because he said, we're going to give it to 2 writers, and that's against the rules. He didn't say...
Had they ever awarded it to 2
They
writers
did.
before?
Michael Ondaatje, The English Patient. That was the last time it had been given to Ondaatje and somebody, another writer. I can't remember his
The other
name.
guy.
I hadn't read the book. Anyway, Barry Unsworth, I think it was. Somebody called Barry Unsworth. They had both won it in 1992. And then they changed the rules to stop that happening again. And so Peter Florence stood up and said, we've broken the rules, or said something like that. I can't remember what he said. He said, Margaret Atwood, right, has won it, and Atwood. So it could have been any of us after that. And then I was just like, oh, God, it's got to be me, it's got to be me. And it was. And then I just swore. I was at table with my editor, my agent, my husband, and I was just like swearing. It's like I had Tourette's syndrome. I just couldn't control it. And then Margaret had got up, I got up, and we sort of linked. I think we linked arms or linked hands, and we walked onto the stage. And it was just lovely. And she was just so lovely. She basically handed me the mic to give my speech because she's won it before, and also it was for the Testaments, which is such a huge book. So she was just lovely and generous. And then we spent the next day just doing back-to-back media. And that day, in fact, that evening, back-to-back media. That was it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's so exciting. If we can go back maybe to Manifesto, I know you say that it's not necessarily a deeply personal book, but you share some personal moments. You see your father on one side of the street. He's Nigerian. You get embarrassed by him. You pretend like you don't see him. You talk about your relationships. You talk about failure. And I know in the book you say you're not necessarily a believer in therapy, but your writing is your therapy. And I wondered, writing this book, I know you said it isn't, it's not a normal memoir. It's broken into sections that have formed your life and formed your creative process. There's a manifesto at the end with her kind of your life lessons of how you should live your life. It's different. Did you find the process therapeutic? Did you learn anything about yourself and your own, creative process when you were writing about your creative process?
Yeah, it's interesting because I have written about myself a little bit in essay form in the past, but it's very different putting it all into a single book and knowing that you are presenting yourself to the world in this way. And I did dig deep, I think. I really thought quite deeply about my relationship with my parents and what they had given me, and also about my relationships with other people. And, I have had, some toxic relationships that went on far too long. And, I kind of, in writing about them in this book, I suddenly thought, my God, why did you do that? It's very strange. Almost like you're looking at a stranger who's behaving in a way that you would tell them not to. It's like, get out of that relationship, So it was revealing. I was revealing myself to the reader, but also I was learning about myself as well through the act of writing. The whole theme about never giving up, and sometimes you should give up. So, some of my books I've spent years on, and then literally one of them in particular threw it in the bin, and then rewrote it in a different literary form, for example. And that could have been a much faster process, I think. And I suppose because I was looking at the obstacles that I faced, not that I present myself as a victim in any way, because I'd never do that.
You never do that.
No. But looking at the obstacles and then realizing that actually, these were big things in my life, but that I never allowed myself to be crushed by anything. Even though I was once in a relationship where I was almost crushed. But then that taught me never to be crushed again, never to fall into that trap again.
I'd also like to talk about just writing in general, your process as a writer. If you could help kind of paint some broad strokes about your writing, we'd love that. I guess the first question would be, what is the best thing about writing?
I suppose it's that you're creating unique stories. I'm creating unique stories. So I find the act of writing very all-absorbing when it's going well. I love inhabiting characters. For me, that's the joy of writing, creating characters who are not myself and living inside them, creating them from the inside and then living with them during the course of the novel that I'm working on. I love the fact that I am introducing readers to different perspectives, that I am sharing my knowledge of the world, my perspective of the world through the different characters that I create, who are often very, very different to myself. I love, I love the fact that I'm a communicator as a writer, and that once the book's finished, it goes out there into the world and you know that you are impacting on other people's lives. You don't quite know how. You don't often know how many, but you know that your imagination is being experienced by other people.
Do you have a favorite character from your novels that you've inhabited or spent time with?
So the book before Go Woman Other is called Mr. Loverman, and it's about a 74-year-old Caribbean man who is gay and in the closet. And he lives in London, and he has been in the closet ever since he was 14. He's also been married to his wife for 50 years. He's a father and grandfather, and she doesn't know that he's gay, and has been lovers with his best friend for 60 years. And he is a character with a great deal of joie de vivre. He's larger than life. He's complicated and complex, but he's also very funny. And he gave me a great deal of joy writing him because he's quite outrageous. And I found that he emerged fully formed. And of course, I am not anything like him in any way whatsoever. But I became him. And even today, when I revisit that book, I just experience the joy I felt in writing him, and just the joy of having created this character who is just so full of life and exciting and different, because nobody writes that kind of novel. 74-year-old gay Caribbean man in the closet, blah, blah, blah.
So specific.
Very specific, yes.
And do you reread your novels?
No, not at all. No, I read from my books when I have to for events, but I don't reread. Actually, with Go Woman Other, the two favourite characters are Hattie, although I do love them all, but anyway, Hattie and Yaz. So the oldest character, who's 93, and is a farmer in the north of England, and Yaz, who is the young university student.
I love Yaz. She's phenomenal.
She makes me laugh, so yeah.
Very funny. Okay, what is the worst thing about writing?
Yeah, positive thinker, right?
I know. I'm so sorry. Manifest negative.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
All right. Which have you found more difficult? Writing fiction or writing autobiography?
Memoir is very easy. Extremely easy, because you don't have to create a fictional world. You're writing the truth as you know it, as you see it, as you've experienced it. And it's not, well, it shouldn't be made up, right? So, and of course there are different versions of the truth, we know that, but it was very, very easy to write the memoir. I've talked about myself a lot anyway as a writer, at events like this for a very long time, and I found a form that could contain my story, and it just kind of wrote itself, really.
And how do you feel when you finish a book?
It varies. Sometimes I'm so relieved because oh, God's sake, it's done. Because it's a marathon, it can take a lot out of you. And then sometimes I'm a bit sad to leave the characters behind. So with Mr. Loverman, I was sad to leave Barrington behind. One of my novels, The Emperor's Babe, which is about a black girl growing up in Roman London 1800 years ago, which has a bit of the spirit of Mr. Loverman. It's got a lot of comedy in it, and she's a very lively character. She's 18 years old. It goes from the age of 11 to 18. I felt very sad when I finished the book because I wasn't ready to let her go, in a sense. So it varies from book to book.
And do your friends or family ever look for themselves in your fiction novels?
Yes. So one of my novels, Soul Taurus, is based on a journey I took in the late 80s across Europe with a friend of mine, and she heard about the book and objected to it, and then came to an event I gave and heckled me, which was just the most awful thing. Came onto the stage and heckled me because she said I had stolen her story. The truth was, I had written a fiction based on this trip that we had taken, but that's not how she saw it. So that was very difficult. And also, when I wrote the book Lara that I mentioned about in the 90s, I talk about my mother's aunt's husband, who was German Jewish doctor, who came to Britain in the 1930s and married my mother's aunt. And then when my mother married my father in the 1950s, he and the aunt disowned my mother because she had married a black man. So he features in Lara, but the point at which I wrote about him, he had had nothing to do with our family I'd never met him for like 30 years, 40 years. Yeah. But then his wife died, and I got to know him. In fact, he and I became friends. He blamed the wife for cutting off my mother and our family. But he then read the book, and he read his portrayal in the book. Because, of course, when I wrote it, I thought we would never meet him. And he objected to it and asked me to rewrite it, which I didn't do. And then also, my mother had a childhood friend when she was evacuated during the war to the countryside called, I can't remember his name. Anyway, she had this childhood friend, and she hadn't seen him since 1945. And I wrote a portrayal of him based on her memory, and I thought it was a very affectionate portrayal. And he then came into her life through me, because I don't know how he found me. And he also objected to his portrayal in the book, even though it was an affectionate portrayal of like a 9-year-old boy. So yeah, these things happen.
And I know that you, some of your more formative years were in the youth theater group that you went to, and for many of your teenage years. And you're a playwright. You started you started a theater group. Has that informed a lot of your writing or your creative process as well?
Yeah, definitely. I began writing for theatre when I was at drama school, and then performing my plays, and that then sort of became the foundation for my development as a writer. I talked earlier about inhabiting my characters and writing them from the inside. And I think that comes from my theatre days when I was writing for theatre and also playing one-woman shows, also becoming those characters. And that definitely has shaped my work ever since. And also as a theatre person, as an actor and writing for theatre, you are a communicator. So it's, I think my novels are very, I don't want to say communicative, that sounds a bit odd, but the characters definitely pop off the page in the way that they may do if you're going to a theatre. I like them to feel very alive, very vibrant, very, very present. I'm not the kind of writer who writes very quiet sort of novels and quiet characters. They tend to be very kind of lively and, I suppose, a little bit performative and theatrical.
And even the way your sentences are written, it's often in prose, or it is different. It's more poetic. It's almost artistic in how you've written some of your work. Can you walk us through, when you're not touring in all these fabulous places, what's the day in the life like? What's when you're in the middle or starting?
The day in the life. People
when
ask.
Do you get up? What do you do?
People do ask this a lot. I can get up at any time between probably 5 and 7. Probably not much later than that. That's sleeping in. I don't sleep in. So I get up, have coffee. I spend way too much time on the internet. During the certain presidents' years, that would consume my early morning reading in horror. I was like,
Horror.
oh my God. And then more recently, I've kind of forced myself to read first thing in the morning, which is much more restful. And, you know, I think when you're reading, you have an intimate communion with the text if you're enjoying the book. And so I tend to do that these days as opposed to jumping on the internet. And then, you know, in a writing day, I might start writing, I might deal with admin, I might go for a cycle ride, I might go and meet friends. I will get the writing done in between lots of things that I do. I'm not the kind of person who'll sit at my desk for 5, 6, 7 hours without moving. My husband's upstairs in his study, I'm downstairs, and he's always laughing because he can hears me going into the kitchen all the time. Whereas when he's in his study, he doesn't budge for hours. You know, you think he's dead, whereas I cannot sit down for like more than 15 minutes without jumping up and doing something else. But the writing gets done, you know, that is the focus. But I also do lots of other things, you know. I'm a university professor, so I go out and teach as well. I'm involved with the Royal Society of Literature as president, so that also involves me. I'm a Rolex mentor at the moment. You know, I am always juggling lots of things, and those things are part of my writing day. But the writing gets done.
The writing gets done.
Yeah.
We've just got a few more minutes. I want to be cognizant. Does anybody have any questions for Bernardine?
Can you tell us a little bit about that journey from when you finished writing Girl, Woman, Other? Did you think, oh, this is going to be it? Or did your agent say that? How did it go from you closing that book to my book, we're doing it in New York?
So I think I said earlier that when I started writing the book, nobody was really interested in what I was writing about in terms of a novel about lots of different black women. And I have to say this, especially to younger people, because they think the way things are now is sort of symptomatic of the way they've always been. But things have changed quite a lot in the last few years. And so by the time I finished the book, I thought, my God, this book is really topical. But that wasn't the case when I started it. But I thought, this book has got to do something more than my other books, because I'm not really a topical writer. My publisher was very excited by it. And he said to me much later that he had said to the chief at Penguin Random House in the UK that he thought it would be in with a chance of winning the Booker. So he had faith in it. He had faith in it. And then... yeah, and then it just got the reviews, and you know they were great, but it was literally being on that long list that changed everything. So yeah.
Anybody else?
Your book, Blonde Roots, stuck with me for a very, very long time. It was a very impactful book. And now that I know that you're biracial, what was going through your mind as you were writing this? Amazing.
So just very, very briefly, Blonde Roots is a novel that I published in 2008, and I've created an alternate universe where Africans enslave Europeans, and it's a satire. Although it's also tragic, has to be tragic. So it's about a character called Doris who's taken from England by the great Ambosans, and she's enslaved in the New World. Her name is Doris, but they can't pronounce that, so they call her Omarenamwara. I'll give you an understanding of how that works. So basically, it's playing around with all the tropes of civilization, savagery, plays around with the concepts of race and racism, and... it's probably a mind F for some people to read, because it's just like constantly challenging you in terms of what you think this story is about. And I don't know if being biracial particularly affected how I wrote that book, but it was my way of exploring the transatlantic slave trade in a way that explored it so that people would look at it differently, that they would look at it with fresh eyes, which I felt was necessary. Thank you.
Bernardine, thank you so much for your time. Can we all please give her a big round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you.